I believe that we are currently in a culture of chronic quitters. I'm not sure if people are having a hard time committing to things or possibly keeping and honoring the commitments that they make. If you think about people always switching jobs, friends, constantly switching churches, religions, constantly switching boyfriends, constantly switching husbands. In fact, I think that the average Hollywood marriage lasts like about 12 minutes. I think that's actual statistic. And believe it or not, for the Christian, that's a big issue because as followers of Jesus Christ, that's to say that we are apprentices of Him. We have committed our life to follow after Him, and with that comes a commitment to live a life of faithfulness. Even when it's hard, the Christian is the person who can push through and do what God has called them to do, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's frustrating, even when it's hard, even when it's boring. For the Christian, we are called to a life of faithfulness. In fact, I was thinking of this earlier this week, and I wrote down just a couple paragraphs, and I reread it, and I just wanted to share it with you. This is just my words. It's on the screen. If you always leave, if your first response is to give up, if you're the first one to throw in the towel, you won't accomplish anything that matters. You just won't. Your life will be a montage of surface-level relationships and dreams left unfulfilled. But when you let God transform you into a faithful person, listen to this, you can experience the depth of love that comes from living life with trusted friends. You can experience contributing to something significant, something that makes the world a better place. There's deep joy in being dependable, where people can rely on you and trust in your faithfulness to be there for them. Faithful people serving a faithful God. Now that's heaven. We've got 3 brief points for you this morning before we invite some guests up here. We'd like you to write these down really briefly. We'll go over them. Number 1 is this: faithfulness is consistency over time. Faithfulness is consistency over time. Number 2, God is faithful, dependable, and trustworthy. And number 3, as disciples of Jesus, we aim to model His faithfulness. So, briefly, number 1, faithfulness is consistency over time. And really the key to this one, as you probably notice, is over time. That's what makes it hard, but that's what makes it meaningful. Any bozo can be married for 6 months, but to be married for 40 years, that's really something. And I think Brendan Manning, he's one of my favorite writers, he talks about this word monotonous. It's a beautiful word, and it's a word that we tend to use almost exclusively in the negative, right? If we say that speaker's voice is really monotonous, we could like just drill into your head if it's always the same tone all the time. But monotonous is not always a bad thing. In fact, there's a monotony, or you could say a consistency built into the fabric of the universe, without which life wouldn't be possible. So if you think, for example, breathing, right? With very few exceptions, no one in the room has gone more than, let's say, 3 minutes without breathing. Let me ask you a question. Is that boring? It's not boring. It's not boring. It's necessary, right? It's beautiful. The vast majority of us, our hearts beat 42 million times per year. And if you're thinking, if it stops, your heart skips a beat, they'll say that's called arrhythmia, and that's not something that we're striving for. But your heart is always beating day in and day out. Is that boring? No, it's beautiful, right? And so I think you can see the same thing in God. Of course, God, who is the most consistent of all. I love what the writer of Colossians says in chapter 1, verse 17. He, talking about God, is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. It's beautiful. So it's not just that God created it. He spun the top, and then He backs away. Even at this very moment, God is holding the universe together with His loving hands.
For me, consistency is a beautiful thing. For me, I thrive in consistency. I genuinely You take consistency out of my life, and I am a mess. I love consistency. But I think that we often think of that as such a negative in this day and age. We really do, and I do see it in young people in particular, but it's a challenging thing. But if you can shift your thinking and allow God to do some work internally in you to change that, it can become this thing that's life-changing. Because there's beauty in consistency. There's lasting things in consistency. And you're able to actually build on something instead of starting over. And that's huge. It's huge. And I really think when you think about that in the context of relationships, it's even more important. Because the beginning of relationships is the hardest. It's the hardest part. But if you're building and you know that person's always going to be there, there's something beautiful in that. And there's something helpful in that. Yeah. And, I have many relationships in my life that are newer, but I have so many relationships that I've had since I was even a child. And you know what? Those relationships are easy now. We can go months without talking. But I can pick up the phone and call them for any reason, and they're there. Mm-hmm. And that's the beauty of consistency. There's just so much beauty in that, and it's so important to value and put the work forward.
Okay, number 2 is this. God is faithful, dependable, and trustworthy. A quick verse from Lamentations, which we don't go to often. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Beautiful.
Just this is so powerful. These 3 words, and if you truly believe them about God, your life can be changed. Because we don't live in a world full of faithfulness, dependability, and trustworthiness. But if you believe that about God, when everything else is on shaky ground, you have something to hold on to. But you have to believe that, and you have to hang on to that. And you may not even realize that you believe it, but when you enter a hard time, you'll realize you believe it. And never was that more true for us than when we went through our adoption process. There was nothing easy in that. It was everything hard that it could have ever been. But what we learned was that God truly is faithful and dependable and trustworthy. And it didn't take away the hard, but it brought an amazing amount of good. And a lot of that came through people. We saw God's faithfulness through people. They rallied around us. And that, to me, was this beautiful picture of God's faithfulness and God working through people to help us.
Beautiful. Yeah, and that leads us to point number 3, is this: as disciples of Jesus, we aim to model his faithfulness. So, of course, our faithfulness is first and foremost displayed in our commitment to follow after Jesus, to have our lives look like his life. But faithfulness also, consistency also plays out in really practical, everyday ways. In fact, faithfulness is supposed to mark all of the life of the Christian. Just for example, you think of faithfulness in marriage, which is not the same as just not cheating. Right? But that's really what wedding vows are about. If you think about it, you're standing in front of your friends and your family and you're repeating these vows, and essentially what you're talking about is you're talking about being faithful to each other, even when it's hard, right? Even when it's boring, even when it's frustrating, right? Till death do us part, right? So faithfulness is something that we see and we learn from Jesus in the way that he treats us and loves us, and it's something that we model in other people. And I think it might be worth just putting a brief disclaimer in right now, that because what we don't want is for you to feel like what I'm supposed to do, according to Pastor David, is stay in an abusive situation. That is not what we're saying. Right? Faithfulness is staying committed to what God has called you to. But faithfulness is not staying committed to what God has not called you to. And that's a huge point. Right? So it's not faithfulness to stay in a situation that becomes dangerous for you and even your kids. That's not faithfulness, that's stupidity. So I don't know if we could just mark it as red, that as we go on, we're talking about faithfulness and not quitting. But what we're not saying is staying in abusive situations, right? Just it links back to what Marshall and Cindy said in the first week. Choosing the right relationships, that's the key, right? So find the right relationships, find what God has called you to do, and then give everything that you have to that, right? Okay. Number two, our second example of this is faithfulness in community, right? Faithfulness in marriage, but also faithfulness is something that we are to exhibit as a community together. I can say this, that some of you, we have been spiritual family for, let's say, 5 years. Well, the hope is that as long as we keep with it, we will, in 5 years from now, will be spiritual family and have been that for 10 years. And here's what I've learned about spiritual family is that as it gets longer and longer, it gets richer and deeper. Right? So our relationship, as great as it is now, provided that we stay faithful to each other, our relationship will be even more meaningful 5 years down the road, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. Contrast that with people who they're just always jumping around, jumping and skipping different communities, and they become like the potted plant that you pull out of one pot and put it in the next pot and take it out, and because of that, the plant never grows. And so that's what I mean, even when we were talking about that if you're someone who just leaves at the first opportunity, you never become the type of person who gets to experience the depth of living life with community. Okay, good? Anything else? Okay, so we were wanting this to be really practical in the context of not giving up. And so we've asked 3 people who, in our opinion, their lives have been marked by a beautiful faithfulness, a beautiful ability to not give up. And so I'm wondering if you guys could just do an outrageously loud clap for Gorden and Mary Eden and David Goldman as they come up. I don't know if the clap was outrageous, but it was pretty good. Okay. Oh, wow. Okay, take a seat, you guys. Thank you so much for taking time to chat with us. We've got a few questions that we're wanting to ask you. And of course, for the 3 of you, for me and Jordan personally, you guys have been our spiritual family for years and years and years and years. You're part of what define us as people. And so for us, there's so much backstory here. And so everything that you guys say means a lot to us. But we recognize that maybe not everyone here knows you, believe it or not. And so we're wondering if you would just be willing to give a super brief overview. So David Goldman, give us a few sentences on you and tell us how you originally became a part of this community.
Okay, few sentences. Hi, I'm David.
That one doesn't count.
Doesn't? Okay, good. Then I have 2 sentences left.
That one did. Yeah.
Okay, so I am 30. I started coming to this church when I was 15. So I have broken the halfway point. I have now been a part of this church longer than I had not. So that's a good milestone for me. Yeah, you can clap for that. That's good. That's good. I was a sophomore in high school, and so many of you guys are going to be rolling your eyes because you've probably heard this story before. But I was a sophomore in high school, and I was in band. And if you're in band, you can clap for that too. Go band.
No, I'm not clapping for that.
Haters. So many haters out there on band. I was in band, and I was in marching band specifically, and it was a Tuesday evening. And if you don't know, we do our Tuesday evening services, right? And it was a Tuesday evening about like 5 o'clock. And I was talking to this junior who's a little bit older than me, and I said, "Hey, what are you doing tonight?"
This is a female junior.
This is a female junior.
Okay,
yeah. That's a good place to start. It's a good place to start. It's the details, guys. It's the details. And so I said, "Hey, what are you doing tonight?" And she said, "I'm going to church." And I was like, "I like church. I could like church." You like church, I like church. We all like church. I said, but I don't have a car. And so I'll need a ride. And so she drove me to church that night, and I never left. I've literally been living here. Just kidding. No, I started coming on Tuesdays, and I was a part of what was our youth group, which was YX, it's now Royal, and there was a worship night like about a month in, and I just got hooked. Like there was something about worship that just drew me, and I felt God like for the first time like speak to me. Probably not audibly, obviously, but for me anyway. But I felt his presence on my life and pull my heart, maybe stronger than I have ever even since. Just calling me to worship and to be a worship leader. And so I bought a guitar. I didn't know how to play guitar. I played lots of other instruments, but not guitar. But that's what worship leaders did. And so I bought a guitar, and I learned to play guitar. And I was a part of the worship team back there. I helped lead the worship team back there with a extraordinary group of people for many, many years. And I've been a part of this church for the last 15 years, ever since.
Okay, Gordon and Mary, so it boggles the mind that people in this room might not know you. You're a couple of heroes to me and Jordan, personally, of course, but can you give us just a brief couple minutes? You can sum up a life in 30 seconds, right? Just tell us a little bit about yourselves and maybe how you came to be part of the community.
Sure. Gordon's uncle had been a member of this church many, many years ago. We've been attending for 29 years, and he had been asking us to attend church, and we just decided to shut him up, that we would just go one time, and then that would be it. And so we did, and we never left. And we were members of another church, leading actually a youth group, but we felt such a connection to this church. And so when we joined the church, we were all in to everything, being an active member of this church. Gordon and I have been married almost 41 years, and I'm not 30, but in that time, you know, we have seen a lot of challenges and we've experienced a lot of victories. Professionally, I'm employed by Presbyterian Healthcare Services. I started in that organization 27 years ago, and I was an entry-level position, and I was just promoted to senior vice president. And I give God the glory because he has created really opportunity for me, and being faithful in whatever role you have at whatever phase in your career, God presents an opportunity for you, and others notice that, and promotion will come.
And who are you, Blondie?
I'm glad you put it that way. I'm Gordon, and my much better half by every means. As Mary said, we've been together we've been together for over 42 years. And I started off as a New Mexico State police officer in downtown San Juan, New Mexico. I know. And that's what I said when the chief told me where I was going. He said, "You're going to San Juan." I go, "Where's that?"
"Where's that?" I have no idea.
Yeah. It was on Old 66, about 18 miles from the Texas border. I had to look at a map to figure it out. But anyway, as Mary said, we're always blessed by opportunities. And I think most of you that have been at this church for a while know that I was appointed by President Bush to be the United States Marshal. Then I worked for Governor Martinez as Cabinet Secretary for the Department of Public Safety. And then just recently retired as the chief of the Albuquerque Police Department. And give God all the glory because
I just think listening to that, you hear the beauty and faithfulness. You hear that. But there's this other part to their stories, which is everything that happened to get them to those places. And so, David, we've known you since you were 15. And I was even looking at old photos a while back, and all of a sudden, David's face pops up in one of my college graduation photos. And it's like, wow, that was a long time ago, even for me, and he was a part of that. You were a part of that. But what a lot of people don't know is that for you, when you were around 18, your family started to disperse. Your parents and your sister, they started to move to different parts of the nation. And you had a decision to make. You had a decision to make whether to follow with them or stay here with this community. And so tell us about that. Tell us about that process for you.
Yeah, my flock migrated. Right. And I decided that I didn't want to go to warmer places of the country. Literally, they went to Florida and Louisiana. I'm like, nah, I'm good here. I like the mountains. Yeah, so when I was maybe 13 or 14, my dad and my sister moved to New Orleans. Saints fan, yep. And then when I had just turned 18, and my grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side were ill, and they were reaching the end of their life, and I had always been a very independent person. And my mom, she worked so incredibly hard, and she worked really late hours, and so I had just kind of developed my own family with the church and my own friends, and we had this incredible relationship, but I was, again, very independent. And when I turned 18, she said, look, I love you, but I really want to spend some time with my parents before they go at the end of their life. And she said, I am going in 1 month to move to Florida, and I would love for you to come, or you can stay. And I said, wow. Because I didn't have a car or a job. And now my place to stay was flying to Florida. So yeah, I had a decision to make, and my heart was here. I had been leading worship for a couple of years here at the church, and I had made friends and established people that I would call family even at that point. And so I wanted to stay, and so I put this fleece before the Lord. I said, God, I can't do this. I don't know. I don't know what to do. I would like to stay here. Help me out, please. And that week, I kid you not, in 1 week, I had a friend from church let me buy his car for cheap. It was a cool car. It was a race car. It was awesome. I broke it. But it was good for like 2 years. Let me buy his car for cheap. I had another friend call me up, also from church, say, hey, we haven't talked in a couple years. They had stopped going. But I need a roommate. Any chance that you need to? I'm like, actually, yes. And a nonprofit ministry here that in town called Faith Comes by Hearing that I had been applying to for like 6 months called me and said, hey, we would like to give you this position, but it's not going to open for a couple weeks. You wouldn't have any interest in taking this other seasonal position until that one does open. You can start Monday. Wow. And I said, okay, staying here. Thank you, Lord. And yeah, so that made my decision really easy. But again, it was the church. It was the community. It was the pinch hitting from Believer Center that really allowed me to stay. And my heart was always here. And then, the cards just fell in a really great way, and I was able to stay.
So good. And, that's one thing that David Goldman and I are very close friends. He's one of my best friends. We're workout partners. We go to lunch multiple times a week. I probably spend more time with him than anybody else, second to my wife and my daughter. And when I think about our relationship, one thing that really means a lot to me is when I think about this time when he really became not reliant in a bad way, but really reliant, drew a lot of strength from his spiritual family when he didn't have earthly family here in town. So I even think back when you were, in your early 20s and you had nothing to do like on Easter or Christmas. And so we have photos of Christmas Day and Easter where David Goldman was just one of the Eifferts, just hanging out with us as family. And now I think about our relationship and how much deeper it is now than it was 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And that would have all gone away had either of us been less committed to each other and to the community.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Some of my fondest memories, honestly.
So good.
Spending the holidays with the Eifferts.
Yeah. Cute. Okay, question number two for the Edens. I realized I just said number 2 and that felt weird. Second question for the Edens.
We have a toddler.
Right,
That's why it felt weird.
Yeah. As you mentioned, you guys have been married for nearly 41 years. Do I have this right? October 7th? Yes. 41 years married. Incredible. So inspiring to all of us young married couples. But as a family, you guys have had some tremendous challenges, and it hasn't always been easy for you. But I think a lot of us would readily acknowledge that you two have always had, even in the midst of really painful adversity, you guys have always had this really beautiful strength that has just been really dependable. That even when you were going through some of the most painful experiences of your life, you were even available emotionally to support us. So the question is this: talk to us about how you developed that inner strength to endure hardship.
Many here at the church know that we have really faced some health challenges with our daughter, Renee, seated here with us today. And for probably, I would say, the last almost 20 years, we've been all around the country visiting specialists, and Renee has really been the warrior in all of this, and she has endured, so much in her young life. And I'll never forget the time, 8 years ago, she spent 6 months in the hospital. And we had very different conversations because they told us she would never leave and she would likely never go home. And there was a very difficult conversation we had to have with her about how hard would we fight. And Renee turned to us and she said, "I'm not giving up, and I expect you to fight for me." Meaning if she was intubated or she was not in a position to speak for herself, she expected us to be her voice. And so we said, well, we're not giving up. If she's not giving up, we're going to fight. We took turns, whoever would have a bad day. We couldn't both have bad days at the same time. That was the first rule. And we were a team. We were a family. We were a team. And we know we had our church family behind us. So regardless of what we faced, we knew God was in our corner. We knew the church was in our corner. And we stuck together. We really fought. And sometimes you have to fight through really these challenges, the thoughts, the really smart people to come in and tell you how they think it is. And then you say, but God. And there's always, what does God say about something that we had to go to remind us that man may know, but man has limits, but God has no limits.
Amen. Ditto. No, Mary and I, back in the mid-'80s, maybe late '80s, we went to a marriage enrichment group, and it was really, really powerful for both of us. And the man that was up there teaching us put up a triangle, and it had God at the top and then husband and wife on either side. And he talked about the perfect relationship. And he said that, God's always 100% with us, always, okay? So you draw a line down to the man, you draw a line down to the woman, God's still always giving 100%, always, to you, to your spouse, to your family, to your kids. And I just remember one of the comments he made is that what makes long-lasting relationships is how much of that percentage you keep up. So just think about it, 100% back to God, 100% back to Mary, 100% back to God. And you sit there and you think, well, I can't give 200%. Well, that's probably part of the problem. And I'll just say that. People have a tendency to give up because they'll say something like, well, I need somebody to be more in this relationship. I give my 50%, they need to give me 50%. Well, there's the failure right there. So I want to say that made Mary and I extremely strong because I knew when she had a bad day, I had to go up and cover her. So if she had an 80% day, I had to do 120. When I had a 50% day, she gave back to me 150%. That's what got us through and continues to get us through every single day, because when Renee was in her absolute worst state, Mary and I both had to stay at 100% for ourselves, knowing that God had us covered 100%, but Renee needed us both 100%, and so did Josh. And so did Josh. And that's just how you do it, because people are going to have bad days. You and I had bad days when she was in the hospital. You know, I can't tell you how many times I would leave the room and I'd walk down to the end of the room and I'd just bawl. But I knew that I had to clear that out of my head and remind myself of God's faithfulness at 100%. And then that strengthens me to be able to give back to Renee 100%.
Wow, that's some good wisdom. Great wisdom. Okay, David Goldman. So question for you is this. A lot of people find staying in community difficult, especially when it gets some of the classic issues, right? It gets hard, it gets complicated, it gets boring. And so what they do is the natural kind of response is to leave, especially when we get hurt. So is there any advice that you have for us on how to stay committed to relationship for the long haul?
Yes. You ready? I have notes. Oh, good. Watch out. Watch out. No, I'm going to keep it short.
Those are so small, I have no idea how you can read those.
I know. Can you guys see these? Anyway, yes, but let me preface one thing. I thought what you said was so good. I feel that oftentimes what looks like us being faithful is just a response to God's faithfulness in our lives. Yeah. I've been here for 15 years serving in a bunch of different ways. That looks like I'm being really faithful. God gave me people to take care of me and to feed me and to be with me for Christmases and holidays and birthdays. So I stuck around because that's cool, and I'm a human and I need that stuff. Right. So am I faithful? Yeah. Am I sticking around because of my human needs and the church and great people have filled those needs? Yeah. What is that? That's God's faithfulness in my life. Yeah. My response, my faithfulness is a response to his. So anyway, that's a preface. Okay, practically, 2 things. Here we go. Notes. Ask yourself first, why am I here? And I mean actually like at this church. And we're talking about some guidelines, some tips on why to stick around, right? Why am I here? I feel like people have this criteria, whether they know it or not. Their main criteria for choosing a church and maybe staying at that church is, what is the pastor doing for me? That's their main criteria, right? And it's important. It's incredibly important. You should have pastors and leaders and people in your life that can open the Bible to you and challenge your thinking, right? But even Paul in the Bible will say, if you want the meat of the word, you have to get it. So we have to have people. It's important. We have to have people that will open the Bible to us and help us understand the Bible. And you have good leaders here. You have good Bible teachers here. So that's important, super important. But the buck does not stop there, right? Us as Christians, our job does not stop at believing. We are called to go and take care of people, to take care of people in our church and to take care of people in our community, right? And so you ask yourself, why am I here? In a relationship, in any relationship, right? You guys are talking about giving 100% to each other. If you're in a relationship and you're basing your decision on whether to stay in that relationship if they are giving enough to you, but you're not giving anything back in return, your relationship is not going to be good and you're not going to enjoy it. We are called to have community with people. We are called to do something bigger than ourselves, and that's what church is. That is community, right? So you have to be involved, otherwise you're missing out on an incredible blessing on your life. You're not going to get all the benefit that you could be getting out of church if you're not a part of the community in some way. So that's the first thing. Ask yourself, why am I here? Second thing, stop doing what's easy. Stop it. We live in a culture of 2 things. Convenience, right? Every iPhone piece of technology that's coming out right now is how do we make things better, faster, right? Convenience and offense. If you disagree with me, we live on different planets and you've never heard of Facebook, right? You don't have to go very far to find somebody that's being offended. And I'm not saying don't be offended. I'm saying be better at giving grace to the offense. Okay? But they don't mix. Grace and offense do not mix. Offense and convenience, right? Because it is not convenient to have the hard conversation. It's not convenient to show people grace and to give people forgiveness. It's convenient to leave. And that's what we see all the time. People have some kind of offense. Not even just church, every group, every situation, you will be offended because we are human and we are faulty, broken things. And we say dumb stuff. And we're going to hurt people. And if the first time you get hurt, if you can't reciprocate with grace and mercy, then it's not going to work. So you have to have a little bit of perseverance. If you want to be a better Christian, if you want to be a better human, persistence and grace is going to need to be the foundation of any relationship you have. And so we have to have that same ideology, that same grace, that same forgiveness, that same kindness shown towards the church and the people in the church that will hurt you. Otherwise, you're just going to leave and you're going to take the easy way out. Anyway.
So good. That's good.
I think it's just so helpful to hear that it's not easy, because I think we all feel that and experience it, but to know that everyone in the room is experiencing that can hopefully give you hope that we can persevere through it together, because we're family and we should be. And, for Gordon and Mary, for me in particular, you have been family. The joke has always been with Josh that he was the little brother I never wanted. Right. Yeah, right. He talked more than I did, yes, which said something at that point in my life. But Gordon and Mary continued that faithfully when David and I got married, and you guys did some incredible things to help us when we were in the adoption process, more than anyone in this room knows, but honestly, they got us home, which was a miracle. And as you guys talked about, you've given strength in this community to many people in this room, but you've drawn strength. So tell us how we as a community can do that better, how we can support each other better.
I'll say the last 4 years of Gordon's career in law enforcement is tough, in case anyone has not been watching the news. The last 4 years in particular, living in the era that we were, and things were playing out so very publicly. And what I saw out there in the media and others was not a reflection of him as a man, of who he was, who I knew him to be. And I knew that I had to fight against that. I mean, I had my own responsibilities at work to my employer, but I had responsibilities to lift up Gordon too. So I'd text him scripture verses, I'd text him prayers, I'd be out with him in the community, and then our circle of community expanded beyond our church and our friends to an area that I had never expected. And that was the victims of crime. And I found myself, and I remember talking to Cindy about that, and I didn't feel prepared at all for that. He spoke at 2 funerals, he was asked to speak at 2 funerals for some pretty high-profile cases that were tragic and heartbreaking, and how we had to pray just to get through that. And a couple of very high-profile crime victims' family members now work on my team. But I never would have met them had it not been through this circumstance. And so just remaining open and letting God use us, we went into so many hospital rooms and our own officers who were grievously injured. And I would just say, I'm going to say a prayer. If someone wants to leave, please feel free, and we're going to pray. And we saw God move. We saw miracles. There were some really tremendous injuries. And now, sorry, I knew this part was going to get me. Some of the widows of our officers that we laid to rest are our closest friends now. Yeah. And I had never imagined that part of his role, but remaining open, carrying God into those places that if not for us, who was going to do it? And we had that opportunity. We had entry to bring God to those places. And I'm so grateful for it. It grieved us, It was hard, as you can only imagine, but I'm grateful now because I look back and I see if not for God, that would have turned out so completely different.
Ditto. No, and I think it's true, and I would challenge anybody to do this, and I say this with a great sense of love and respect for Mary, is that I would dare you to go to any police chief's website and look up and see if they're with their spouse. It's really kind of interesting. Everybody knew that they could not ride in the right front seat of my car because that's where Mary would sit. And Mary and I did this together, and one of the nights we were having a conversation, and I told Mary, I said, the only way this city's going to change, number one, is we have to pray for them, but number two, we got to get the faith community involved in recognizing that our public servants have tremendous value. And can you imagine our community without firefighters or without police officers? And if your answer is, no, I can't, then you need to be there for them. And what I saw happening, and I've talked to many people about this, is our nation has lost respect for those who serve. They really have, whether it's the military, law enforcement, or first responders. So getting back to what Mary and I talked about, BCA has been very good about doing National Prayer Week and hosting the law enforcement, the first responder community, the school community, the military community into our church and honor them on National Day of Prayer. But not every church does that. God opened doors, and I can't tell you how many church services we went to. And I know some of you are like, well, where's Gorden and Mary? We haven't seen them in a month. Well, the reason is we were at a different church, talking to them about issues, talking to them about God's influence on our government, how we needed to have God back running not only our lives personally as Christians, but put God back into his proper place. And that's at the highest. Pray for our leaders, right? God tells us to do that. And despite the mean and sarcastic statements that were sometimes made about me or about my family or about my team, I would always ask God just to change their heart. Wow. So I really felt compelled that we had to get the church community involved, and I think we have. And I think that we had two really hard incidents happen, and I'm not going to speak particular to each one of them, but it was funny. We went into some of these churches, and people would ask, they'd actually have open dialogue. So there'd be a couple hundred people there, and they were able to ask me questions. And some of the things that happened in those meetings, those church services, where people finally understood what really happened. This is really important, because you do it all the time on social media. What is written doesn't necessarily mean it's right unless it's in the Bible, okay? So sometimes the editors take liberty and remove things. Sometimes reporters take liberty because of time constraint to report certain things that are not accurate. It boils down to a key component of faithfulness is trust. And when we would walk out of places or venues that didn't go very well, I still remembered thanking God for trusting us to go into that place and just speak the truth to them. And I know it was hard on my kids. Josh changed his last name 2 or 3 times. It was pretty bad. But I get back to our whole theme is faithfulness, and your faithfulness is built on trust. Beautiful. And you know what's really good? We don't have to earn God's trust. We don't. he gives to us his love, his trust, his compassion, his forgiveness, his grace. He gives, he gives, he gives, he gives, he gives. We just have to sit there and be the sponge to absorb it, and then do what he tells you to do.
Okay, I think we've run out of time. Will you please stand with us on your feet? And as you do that, can you thank Mary and Gordon and David for coming and sharing with us? Thank you, guys. You can take your seats or head down. Just one final thought I had for you as you head out. It's interesting to note that in the New Testament, the word faith and the word faithfulness are actually the same word. Isn't that interesting? Because for the English reader, those are two completely different things, right? Faith is something that you have kind of like internally, right? And faithfulness is something that you do on the outside. So the modern reader would make a big distinction between those two things. But in the original translation, it was both this word pistis, which is not a great thing to name your child. Steve meet pistis. So it's interesting that when the English translators would come upon the word, they had a choice to make. They had to decide whether or not they wanted to translate it faith or faithfulness, depending on the context. And again, that's confusing to us because we make a big distinction, but you have to understand that during biblical times, to have faith would mean that you're certainly faithful. And that you're faithful, if you are faithful, it's certainly because you have faith. And I think that's such an important key for us is to understand that your faith is expressed through faithfulness. Your faith is expressed through your faithfulness. And again, the model, if you're ever unsure how to find the strength to do it, in every case, it's looking to God as the example. Right, that you learn from him. Are you ever around a kid that's learning a language? I think it's amazing, these little 2-year-olds picking up hundreds of words, and effortlessly. And you put a kid in a bilingual, raise them in a bilingual way. They're picking up both languages, no problem. But now you try to have a 50-year-old try to learn a language. It's agony. Right. So how does a kid learn a language? They just imitate. Right, and thus is the secret to the Christian life, is that we would look to Jesus and we would just imitate him, right? So we would see Jesus on the cross saying, Father, forgive them. And so, okay, Father, forgive them. That feels really weird, but that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go and look at someone who has wronged me, and I'll say, I forgive you, because I'm modeling the way of Jesus. And Jesus is so incredibly faithful to each and every one of us. And so we see his faithfulness and we model faithfulness in our lives.